Okay,
All right.
I think we started.
Okay.
So it's hard to tell.
So I'm Anna.
I'm Fisher.
We're going to do a little talk about what we refer to as the liberating structures DNA. We're doing this as part of the University of Iowa's Humanities for the Public Good Liberating Structures Learning Series. Anything else? What's going on? You're trying to figure out the recording.
I went into full presentation mode,
Oh.
and now it's presenting in a window.
Do you want to stop it?
No, I mean, I don't care if people see that. I'm technically incompetent.
All right, well, hopefully people can see these slides. This is, we do pieces of this lecture. We usually try to make it a micro lecture, which in my mind just means it's under like 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes max. We do it when we do immersion workshops.
And we're in the middle of one.
And
that's why we're doing this, because we were with the Humanities for the Public Good at the University of Iowa.
I just said that.
I was trying to figure out the technology.
And so,
God damn it.
All right. We got cusses. It's early morning. It's the coffee time. So this is just intended to give a little bit of a backdrop of some of the underlayers of liberating structures. So we'll do this pretty quickly. But.
So when we talk about the DNA, we're referring to not this.
Can we get rid of that?
I don't know. I don't think so.
I'm in charge of the tech.
Okay, cool.
Look, we're going to go like that, and that's going to disappear. Look.
Cool. Great.
Okay, so what are liberating structures? In the first learning series, we had folks put into chat what the words liberating and structures mean to them, and they were just beautiful, incredibly thoughtful descriptions of that. And so we'll be posting that online soon and sending it out with this. But there are a lot of different ways that people describe the repertoire or the set of methods that is liberating structures. A couple ways that might be useful are that they're a collection of tools and facilitation techniques that do share similar principles. And in the first session, we worked with those principles some. You can find those on the website as well. They're really designed to help us work with complexity more meaningfully. And we'll talk a little bit more about complexity science and where that comes from. But yeah, they're intended to help us facilitate individual or group interactions. I like the idea of an individual interaction. That's engaging, lively, purposeful, and really taps into more of each person's intelligence and creativity and makes more possible. That's the basic. There's lots of other ways to say it, but this is the original repertoire.
It is. These are the 33 that Keith and Henry, who we'll talk about in a moment, kind of put together and composed into a palette or repertoire of methods that.
Yeah. And now there are
design language.
Many more emerging structures that people often refer to as liberating structures.
So one of the ways that we tend to think about this is in sort of three scales, and it's fun to think of it a little bit as an ecology. So there's the scale of the DNA, which is what we'll talk about next. There's the anatomy, which is what happens when all of the DNA gets combined into an assembly. And that is what we often think of as a single liberating structure. It is by specifying the DNA that each method gets a kind of purposefulness to it and has sort of clarity. And then that collection of methods, as Anna was just suggesting, is held together in this evolving repertoire. And that repertoire is mutating and growing and changing as new things get added, new kind of possibilities pop into view as practitioners really modify, interpret the methods and use those methods in very different contexts than what they were originally developed in. And really cool new discoveries are made when that is happening. And so we're going to talk really briefly about the DNA level. So Keith and Henry, I think this is really part of the big contribution that they made beyond just having a repertoire described, is that they identified 5 micro-organizing or micro-design elements that are persistent and present in all of our interactions. So these aren't the only 5 that are part of our interactions, but I think they're 5 that can be often described in a pretty specific way. And so those 5 are the making of an invitation, and invitation we often also sometimes describe as the prompt or the question or the task or the content of what people are going to be working with.
Yeah, it sort of gets at the invitation within a structure often is where it's where there's like often like a verbal expression of the purpose or the topic that is getting. So there's lots of different ways that people use that word in the LS network. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of can be a difficult one to track down actually.
Then the second element is sort of the allocation of time or the sequencing of steps. That's really like how much time is allotted to each part of the structure. You know, in a structure like impromptu networking, it's, talk to your partner for 4 minutes or whatever amount of time you're going to have people talk to each other for.
Over 3 rounds. So it's a lot, it's a bundling of a lot of the mechanics. A lot of the mechanics end up landing over in the steps and timing. And yeah, there's lots of good conversation about the nature of time and how we think about time and how tightly timed a lot of the time boxes are in the LS, the original repertoire, and how we're really kind of messing with that as a network, which is pretty fun. And then space is the physical space. Typically, as we've thought about it, it's super fun to think about space as we think about moving into virtual settings, because we can think about different visual canvases, we can think about the chat space, and then each individual person is in some kind of room that you may or may not see in the collective gallery view or even portrait view or a fishbowl view. It's super fun to start thinking about space as we get into the virtual work more. In a physical environment, we're often thinking about how we're harvesting information and documenting so that everyone can see it, the arrangement of chairs, the removal of tables often, the clearing of space so that people can move in the space more freely, where we put materials. So yeah, that's like a juicy one right now to get to think about. And then the configuring of groups. The configuring of groups, the way it's referred to in the DNA, is often about group size. Sometimes it relates to like who might be in a group. Like sometimes people might organize their groups related to like the function within an organization. Often we don't specify that's particularly, but there are certain structures that can make sense, like what I need from you. Or, yeah, and then participation is one of my favorites. Participation is really, I think, undertended to for a lot of people. It's specifying what it is that our task actually is, depending on the different parts that we might play in a structure. And so there are often structures where one person is speaking and another person or several other people are listening. And for example, the conversation cafe that we did, there's a lot of information about how to participate, how to listen, how to pay attention. And I don't know that I love the idea that we're trying to control how people participate, but I do appreciate that when we specify that listening is important enough to specify like how and qualities of really good listening, I think it values that work more and that labor more. And I think there's a lot of potential in participation.
So combine these 5 elements, get put together almost into like a set of instructions for each method. So you take these 5 elements, you describe them in a sequence of steps or a sequence of instructions, and there's usually, a purpose to it or a reason that you would use the method. And together, those are what kind of gets assembled into the thing that we think of as a liberating structure. These are just like little quick, again, summary. So the invitation is the question, the task, or the instructions, the content, the prompt. The spatial arrangement can be the physical or virtual workspaces, the way people arrange their bodies relative to each other in a structure like Troika consulting. The arrangement of space ends up being pretty particular when the person who's receiving a consultation actually, when in person, turns their back on the two people that are consulting them and listens in as they get help. The sequence and allocation of time, again, about how much time is allocated to each part of an interaction. Configuration of groups, as Anna described, often is the number of people in a particular interaction, and sometimes the configurations can be related to role or function, but infrequently, at least in the liberating structures. And then the participation and how it's distributed, and making sure that that's specified so everyone understands the ways that they are contributing and valuing the multiple forms of contribution that get made in a group.
So we really emphasize the DNA, these micro design elements specifically, because when people learn the structures, these are the core elements that they're tending to learn. And then when you start to modify liberating structures for your purposes or for virtual space or, you know, any different experimentation that you might do, it can be quite helpful to look through the different micro design elements as lenses for how you might want or need to make changes. So, all right.
And just to sort of emphasize the fact that these 5 elements kind of persist in our different interaction styles. Keith and Henry identified sort of some conventional methods of interaction that we've sort of inherited. In this case, one of them perhaps from, this is a little cynical, so I apologize for that. You know, inherited it maybe from the church, the military, the monarchy, and that's the presentation. And if you look at it, the presentation does have a purpose, and the purpose of it is for everyone to hear or see the same information simultaneously. It's really good at that. Whether or not people understand, comprehend, get the information, who knows? But it is very good at making sure everyone has received the same thing simultaneously. And if you think about it, an invitation for a presentation, even what you're doing right now, you've been implicitly invited to sit there and listen to us talk.
But what's cool about this presentation, it's recorded.
It's recorded.
They can just like
you can just scroll right through this part.
You don't even have to click on it.
Maybe we should even do this part in like triple time.
Yeah, yeah, I recommend it for sure.
The time allocated for a presentation.
We gave ourselves the goal of 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah,
we're gonna totally
obliterate it. Well, no, we gotta be off by 8.
So, you know, unless you're at TED, people tend to present for as long as they're going to present for. The space is usually the person who's presenting in the front of the room, on top of the stage, looking down at everyone. They're the one that has freedom of movement. Everyone else is usually fixed in a seat looking up at them.
This is like, I was just describing the groups, you know, the one person down at the front, maybe at a podium to the rest of us. And then, you know, and then for us right now, the 2 of us, and then the rest of you. And then the specification for participation is directly linked to the invitation. So it's listen to me from start to finish. This is my undergrad. Lovingly, UC Davis, I love you so much. Great, you know, wonderful experience in many ways. I was an anthropology major, and let's just say most of my classes were stadium seating, 600-person lectures with, you know.
So one of the things that we like to point out, I think, is part of what, at least for me, liberating structures is trying to achieve, is it's trying to make available more of each person's intelligence, imagination, and creativity to the group. It's trying to really bring that forward. And a presentation is really, in many ways, relying on a single person's imagination, intelligence, and creativity. It's really neglecting 99% of everyone else's contribution, at least in most ways. And so I think it's a good example of how it's not necessarily inviting more of everyone's contribution.
But it does invite everybody else to like relax a little bit, which can be cool. Okay.
Great. The other one, this is just the opposite end of the spectrum. We'll talk about this real briefly.
And this is good to just, in the Liberating Structures Network, if you interact with other Liberating Structures practitioners, this term is used a lot, the Go Rodeo. We are in Texas, so this is actually a reference point that people know and have, which is fun. Not where I came from, California. No one knew what I was talking about, so that's cool, even though I went to Davis.
Same thing, if you look at it through the lenses, the promise or the purpose of an open discussion is to maybe vent if you need to express yourself.
I think there's often a desire to like include everyone. I think this is the opposite end. This is like, for those of us that have like well-intended, like I come out of social work and, you know, it's nonprofits, and it's like our intention is to include everyone. But the reality is, it's just the couple of people who feel confident talking usually.
So same thing, invitation to an open discussion. Here's the topic, you know, free for all for some arbitrary amount of time. Space, often, you know, people bunched or clustered together, maybe in a circle. It's one big undivided group with very hidden or often subtle alliances or, you know, collaborations among people in the group, and the participation is distributed mostly. I like this description: whoever can bite, kick, and scream the loudest, or whoever feels like their voice deserves to be heard.
There's another version of the open discussion that I think we could describe, which is like the circle. It's the circle time. It's like incredibly tense open circle, and like, it's very scary to speak in that open circle. So you really are going to hear people who are much more, it's almost a presentation.
Yeah, totally.
It's really, so it does show up in a lot of different forms, but this is usually pretty recognizable to people.
So a liberating structure also, you know, has those 5 elements, and the idea is to describe those 5 elements, specify them in the minimum way possible. What's the minimum amount of structure? So in an open discussion, there's maybe a little under-structured presentation, over-structured. Liberating structures are trying to find that very, you know, fine line between what's the minimum structure necessary to work with at least more of each person's intelligence, contribution, imagination.
Yeah, that's the ambition.
That's the ambition of it.
Whether or not they do it, right?
Yeah, totally.
And some of them do it better than others, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
But at the anatomy level, a liberating structure sort of has this descriptive title. It's usually a little playful. There is some statement that helps you understand what it's at least trying to do. And those purpose statements, I think we often feel like there's a proliferation of them. Like each structure can be used for many, many, many more things than what's described there.
It like, definitely there's certain ways you can use those purpose statements to get you access or find other ones that you might not have found.
Then there's these little icons that are lovingly designed by Leslie Jacobs, and a set of instructions or steps. And then here's the sort of evolving repertoire scale. This just shows the current formal repertoire, but we've suggested and you've already experienced in the workshop, a couple of other structures like the move around and the spiral journal and some others that are being developed. And just a little loving bow to Keith and Henry, the 2 co-developers of Liberating Structures. I think it's important to say, like, they wrote down the methods in a particular way. And I think they're very clear that they drew inspiration from many, many other practices, other disciplines, other methods, other practitioners. And as we just shared, they basically wrote them down with a similar logic, a similar way of describing each method, and providing people with a way to invent or share methods or practices that they might have in a way that other people could use. So for instance, in your teaching practice, maybe you have this cool little way of working with students. And if you wanted to try, you could write that down using those 5 design elements in a way that, you know, maybe other people could replicate or learn from or try themselves. So just a bow to them. And then just the tiniest bit about what inspired it and where it's headed. We probably won't do the full bit on complexity science.
No, I think the most important thing for folks to know about complexity science, and we can do another one of these on complexity if that's helpful to people or interesting. Complexity science is essentially sort of the idea that humans in groups and maybe in society in general operate a little bit more like the natural systems of the world than like machines. And yet a lot of our organizations and institutions were sort of designed around the machine idea. And so we can maybe get a lot more done and shape things more meaningfully if we try to treat ourselves a little bit more like those natural biologic systems. Yeah?
Yeah, I think that there's a whole range of things that we've talked about with complexity science and how it shapes liberating structures. I think for me, one of the underlying attributes is liberating structures don't promise certainty, right? Like the output or the result or what gets generated is often novel. And that is kind of a particularity of complex adaptive systems, is that the way in which the elements interact and combined generate something unpredictable and often novel. So if you're looking for novelty, these are a way to get there.
Let's not go down the complexity.
No, we're not going to go down it too deeply.
Not today.
Okay.
But we might maybe we should do another video on it, because there's a lot that is revealing about liberating structures if you do understand complexity.
The answer of a new video is only once we look at this and see how humiliating it is.
It's going to be great. All right.
All right.
That's good?
I guess.
Okay. We'll see you soon. Tuesday.
Cool.
You have to stop my recording though.